Please be seated. Today's gospel picks up Jesus as he leaves the synagogue. If you were here last week, we read the story about Jesus driving out the unclean spirit from the man at the synagogue. Today we see Jesus leave. He doesn't go very far, just down the street to Peter's house. This is a typical Sabbath. After church, they go home for the noonday meal and then probably lay around or sit around telling stories and laughing and generally enjoying each other's company in the afternoon. Yes, the healing. Oh, yes. Peter's mother-in-law. She had a fever, and Jesus touched her. He took her hand, lifted her up. She got up, and the fever left her, and she served them. It was as simple as that. And now Jesus and his friends are enjoying the afternoon off. But when evening comes, it's a different matter. The Sabbath is over, and that means the people come out. When Sam and I were in Jerusalem, we went to Ben Yehuda Street. It's a pedestrian street, and we went there on the Sabbath, probably about an hour before dark. And we walked up and down the street, and there were a few tourists wandering around, but not a single shop was open. It was almost like a ghost town. As the sun went down, the shop doors opened, and the merchants placed their wares out on the sidewalks to attract customers. Before long, it was so packed with people that it was hard to move. At one end, there was a large crowd gathered, and we could hear music coming from the center of this crowd. So we sort of worked our way in so we could see what was happening. Well, there was a group of people dancing in the middle of this crowd, dancing to what sounded like typical Israeli music. But there was this old rabbi frantically running from one side of the group to the other, yelling, "Messianics, Messianics, go away, these are Messianics," meaning that these were people who believed in Jesus. He was warning everybody to beware of them because these people believed in Jesus. This place had literally come alive from an hour before when all had seemed deserted. So I can see this group gathered around Peter's house just after dark, shoving and pushing and trying to see who was there and what was going on, hoping that this miracle worker might do some more miracles, bringing people and relatives who had not been at synagogue that morning, who needed healing. If Jesus wanted proof of the efficacy, the effectiveness of his ministry, here it was. This was the proof that what he was doing was good and vital and much to be desired by the people. Finally, after a very long day and a late night, the last of the visitors leave, and this motley crew, Jesus and his disciples, finally fall asleep. Well, when morning came, the birds were singing, sounds of people beginning to stir in the distance. The guys wake up and they realize Jesus isn't there. And they start looking around and they can't find him, so they go out further afield. The neighbors start showing up at the door and they want to see Jesus, but he's nowhere to be found. So Peter and Andrew and James and John spread out further and started looking in the surrounding areas. Eventually, they finally find him up on a hilltop overlooking Capernaum. He's sitting under a tree. He's been there since about 4 a.m. The NRSV calls this a deserted place. The RSV calls it a lonely place. But it's more than that. The word eremos, which means a place where someone might go to be alone in order to make crucial decisions. It is a place where you are not only alone, but it is also quiet enough to hear the voice of God. We might be tempted to say, Crucial decisions. What's the decision he needs to make? He's a hit. He's a success. People want him to stay. What's to decide? Go back down and be their pastor. But the problem is, success has a tendency to turn one's head and we get puffed up. More often than not, when things are going well, we just sort of keep moving with the momentum. And why stop when we're on a roll? When we do that, we are often operating out of our own power rather than relying on God's power. Too many people don't think about calling on God until things have gotten into such a mess that it's the only way they can get out is with God's help. But Jesus, at the very beginning of his success in Capernaum, goes out on a lonely hill to talk to his Father, to pray, to revitalize, to listen to God's voice, telling him where to go, what to do next. Jesus doesn't let success pull him over the edge. He remains focused and tells the disciples, we move on. Others need to hear this message also. How often do we stop in the middle of our busyness and talk to God about what's going on in our life? I know for me, sometimes it's not as often as it needs to be. Sometimes just enough to get me through that day or the next thing I have to do. Jesus' decision here is not between good and bad. Our choices are seldom that simple, black and white. I know that regardless of where I am, God can and will use me for his purpose. If I were still teaching school, God would still use me to touch people where I was. But I also know that since he has called me out of that place in my life to where I am now, I'm able to touch even more lives. Our effectiveness as Christians in this world is directly affected by our continued communication with God. I remember one course in seminary. It was a 1-hour lab attached to our Old Testament class. The textbook was called The Word is Very Near You. And the idea was that as a small group, we would get together once a week, led by a senior student, to practice being in the eremos, listening to God's voice through Scripture, and spending that time in silent prayer. One of the young men in our group was a Lutheran, and he was very impatient, and he rebelled at the idea that we were to sit quietly. So his comment was, I don't have to pray. My whole life is a prayer. Here, a number of years later, I remember that remark, and I think if anyone had a right to say that, it was Jesus. And yet, here he is out in the eremos, talking to his Father, recharging his batteries, deciding where to go next and what to do next. We are encouraged to find some time to spend with God each day. We got Lent coming up pretty soon, and that's a good place to start if you're not currently doing that. Out of the 3 examples we have of Jesus praying in Mark's Gospel, one example, this one, is in the morning. The other 2 are in the evening. The second time Jesus prays was after feeding 5,000 people. He went up on a mountain to pray by himself, following another success. And he walks on the water after he finishes praying. The third time is in the Garden of Gethsemane, another decision point, a time of great need, a time that he needs strength from God to go through what he is about to go through. One of the things that I find of value or benefit from morning time with God is that I don't know what's going to face me during the day on any given day. But people expect certain things from me, a beneficial word, a comforting word, direction, understanding, whatever it is. It just really helps me to have started my day in prayer, to be able to respond to each person in the way that they need. When I've done even the minimum amount of prayer time in the morning, I find that I don't panic when faced by a situation. I don't jump to conclusions, and I don't run off in my own direction. I'm able to focus on what God has placed before me and tie into the gifts and the knowledge that He has given me. The other thing about today's gospel that really strikes me, the disciples tell Jesus, "Everyone is searching for you." This is almost an admonishment. Why aren't you where people can find you? My co-author wrote a book called Looking for Jesus. She said it really surprised her when she grew up and found out people were looking for Jesus, because growing up she always thought Jesus lived right there at their house. I think there's a very important point in this idea of looking for Jesus. We are all looking for something in this life, maybe to help us hold it all together, maybe to get past some stumbling block in life, maybe to help us get ahead, or to try to figure out what to do, where to go next. There are many people who are searching for meaning, for love, for significance, for acceptance, for assurance that their life has purpose. Some people look for it in drugs, alcohol, sex. Some people are so desperate for attention that they will settle for a poor or abusive relationship, or they will act out because negative attention is better than no attention at all. The people from Capernaum saw in Jesus someone who could help them solve their problems. But what they may have overlooked, Jesus was always someone who could help them past their troubles. He was someone who could help them move on from the place where they were to the place they needed to be. This reminds me of a song that I've actually never sung by itself. I usually sing it with another song that I sing, but it totally expresses what I've grown to know is true, and it goes something like this. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above Him there's no other. Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above Him there's no other. Jesus is the way. Goes on to say, if you have some questions in the corner of your mind, any traces of discouragement or peace you cannot find, reflections on old past, they seem to face you every day. There's one thing I know for sure. Jesus is the way. The people of Capernaum came looking for Jesus in the place where they had last seen Him. But He wasn't there. He had moved on. He knows there are more places to go and more people to help, more demons to overcome. Jesus doesn't stay in the last place that we saw Him. He always is ready to lead us down new paths. The question is, are we ready and willing to follow Him? Are we like Andrew and Peter and James and John? Have we gone out to meet Jesus and to follow Him into the world and into new adventures? Or are we still back in Capernaum, looking for Jesus in the same old place? Amen.